Hello, Claire. I would love for you to briefly introduce yourself. Who is Claire and what do you do?
I'm Claire Hamlett. I am currently doing a PhD in animal ethics at the University of Roehampton in England. For the last 5 years, though, before that, I was a freelance journalist writing on animals, environment, and climate. So I did a lot on animal agriculture, and animal welfare in particular.
Okay, that's very relevant to the topic of today, being wool. And you actually went vegan after you started researching the animal industry, right?
So I had been vegetarian for a long time, and then I wrote an article on a documentary that came out. I think it was by Viva, which is one of the UK animal protection and vegan charity. And they'd done an investigation into some pig farms in the UK. So it wasn't even specifically about stuff that I was eating. It wasn't about cheese or eggs, but just something about it. I just couldn't, after that, I watched it, was in floods of tears and was like, I'm done. So went vegan then. So that was back in 2020.
And since you've been engaging and being more active in animal activism, is there a particular industry you focus on most?
In my journalism, it was a lot on the meat industry, so particularly on factory farming, but also just any kind of animal exploitation. But meat industry was the big area that I wrote a lot on because obviously it's not only bad for the animals, it's bad for the environment, it's often bad for the people working in the industry. It's bad for people's health to be eating that much meat. So there's a lot of negatives about it.
Of course, the meat industry is super big. And when people think about vegans in general, it's always about what they eat. But of course, the topic is way broader than that. It's about not using animals in any, possible case. If you don't have to, just don't, basically. And so today we're talking about wool, which some people say is actually a byproduct of the meat industry. Is that something that is true?
It sort of depends on the country. So in the UK where I am, it is a byproduct because it's not economically that valuable on its own to be like an industry unto itself. But in countries like Australia and New Zealand, which have like some of the biggest sheep populations in the world, they have like a dual purpose industry. So the sheep are bred both for their wool and for their meat. But either way, and also in the UK, they'll end up in the slaughterhouse. So it doesn't really matter what they're bred for. It just, that just the only difference that really makes is how long they'll get to live for, really. Also, these are domesticated animals. They're not wild sheep anymore. So they've been bred to produce wool and meat in a certain way. And they're often exposed to the elements. They're exposed to predators, they're exposed to all sorts of things. Basically, just in my back garden in a field near to me, we've got horrible weather at the moment. It's bucketing down, and there's a field full of sheep there. And it might seem all very nice and picturesque. It's quite a small flock. They're grazing on some turnips that were planted a little while ago, but they're obviously suffering. They're heavily pregnant. They fall on their backs frequently. Lots of them are limping. They're lame. There's been a dead one there for at least 5 days that nobody's come to remove. So they're really just being left to fend for themselves. They don't have any
Why are they
water.
why are they neglected like this? Why is this happening?
I mean, really, it's just no one's checking. Like, so, the UK is supposed to have very high animal welfare regulations. The meat industry and the animal industries here always saying, oh, we've got the best welfare regulations in the world. And they really pride themselves on this. But then actually, when you see the day-to-day reality, there's not really people coming to check that they're abiding by the regulations. A lot of things are just guidelines. So those sheep, for example, are not required to have shelter because it's not in the laws. It's suggested that if the weather is extreme, that it might be good to give them a shelter, but nobody's going to come and check and make sure that you've put shelter out for them. So, the farmer doesn't really have to do a whole lot to look after them.
That's sad. Really
Yeah.
sad. Jumping back into what you just said about sheep always being outside. Do you know why they are always outside and not like locked in very small confined spaces like pigs would be, for instance?
So I think because they do graze, they're sort of used for grazing certain crops on land where it's not being used for other things. So, for example, that field near my house, some years it's used for growing wheat or corn. And so the years that it's not growing that, it needs some other kind of crops growing there to stop from soil erosion and that kind of thing. So they plant turnips and things that then the sheep will come out and graze because they don't need to harvest those turnips. So they just use the sheep for that kind of purpose.
So they're basically
They're often
maintenance machines.
Yeah, and they're often portrayed as a sort of like natural part of landscapes when they're out grazing in fields. But in a lot of places, Australia and New Zealand, for example, they're introduced animals. They don't come from there. So you can imagine they're not adapted to the environment. They do an awful lot of damage to biodiversity. There's been studies on how much they reduce plant biodiversity in places where they're grazing. It'll be claimed often by the sheep industry that actually they're doing good things for the environment by being out there grazing on it. But the reality is that they're actually just stripping the land of a lot of nutrients. And on top of that, they release a lot of methane, and they are ruminant animals. So, like cows, they also release methane. So, they actually have quite a high greenhouse gas footprint. And this is partly from the methane and partly from the enormous land use that they require.
Wow. Okay. So they're introduced animals. They're not native to a lot of countries, especially Australia, which is the biggest exporter of merino wool, if I'm not mistaken. So the
Yeah.
biggest
Yeah.
exporter in the world of a particular product, they are not native to that particular country, but they take up a lot of space, which is not good. But you said they are bred in a certain way to create wool in a certain way. Can you tell us a little bit more on how sheep have been bred and what, how it impacts their day-to-day life? And, because people always say, yeah, but sheep need to be sheared. That's like,
Mhm.
that's just how it is. Why are you making such a big fuss about this?
Yeah, so wild sheep will just kind of get rid of their wool by rubbing against trees and things like that. So that's how they kind of shed excess wool. But sheep, like pretty much all farmed animals, have been selectively bred to produce more of the products that they're sought after for. So for wool sheep, they've been bred to really grow quite a lot of wool, and they need to be sheared. They also, a lot of them are out in places there are no trees and things like that. So there's also not really opportunities for them to be rubbing themselves against trees to get rid of the wool anyway. So they really need to be sheared when they've been bred for that purpose.
So they actually took away even the possibility of them doing it themselves because we want that wool, of course. We don't want them to shed it on a tree.
Yeah.
That's why maybe
Yeah.
these fields are so open with any protection from sun, rain, whatever.
They are often in fields kept in by electric fencing. They're not like woody sort of landscapes. They're out in the open on the uplands and things like that. So not many places for them to be kind of engaging in the behaviors that their wild relatives would be.
That sounds like we're already stripping away a lot of, the sheep's nature, how it would normally behave in the wild. And what about the amount of wool they're producing? Is that in any way a hindrance to them?
Well, it requires that they are shorn at least once a year. If they're left to just grow with it and grow with it, it can become very heavy and very matted. There was a story of, I think they named her Fiona, a sheep named the loneliest sheep in Britain, who was discovered. She'd got stuck down a cliffside and spotted by some kayakers, and she had quite a lot of wool grown because obviously no one had sheared her for a long time. And so if they are left on their own, domesticated sheep, they will grow in excess of wool, which can be kind of problematic for them to carry around. But the bigger problem is that obviously it requires relatively frequent shearing, and that process itself is quite stressful for them. So, sheep are prey animals, they're quite skittish. They don't necessarily want to be handled particularly much. And actually shearing them really requires restricting them. Often it needs to be done quite quickly. So there's risks of injuries while they're being sheared. There's not always requirements for the shearers to have formal training to do this. The sheep's food and water is often restricted beforehand as well to stop them from soiling the wool and soiling the shearing shed. So there's a lot of things that go into it, and they're handled multiple times through this process, which is really stressful for them. So the whole thing is not really ideal.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have this image of this very friendly old man, an old farmer, cuddling with his sheep and then kind of like helping them breathe again and, giving them a nice cool exterior
Uh-huh.
by shearing their wool off. But what I've seen, it's quite the opposite. Is people who are not, experienced who get hired once a year and they get a quota. They have to shear an amount of sheep within one
Yeah.
hour. And if the quota isn't met, they get fired and it gets quite rough. And it can even lead to actually harming the sheep, right?
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of nasty videos online of the process and how much of these sheep are bleeding, actually.
And that's even just with the actual process of shearing. So we haven't even got into what happens, like the pretty routine mutilations that are also in the sheep industry. So for sheep, it's tail docking and castration. And so as long as it's done when they're
Castration as well.
Yeah, so and it's done with in the UK, it's done with a rubber ring that's put tight around the thing that they want to get rid of until it falls off. So if they are under 7 days old, this can be done without any anesthesia. If they're over 7 days old, it's supposed to require pain relief. But when you actually read the guidance, for example, the National Farmers Union, they suggest to the farmers, oh, if you would like to do these things to your sheep later on, you should consult with a vet. So it's sort of like, oh yeah, go and have a chat with the vet. There's no one coming and saying, no, you can't do this. There's not really that much enforcement of these things. We know that there's a really small number of inspectors who will go around and actually make sure farms are complying with animal welfare laws when they go through these processes. There's no one necessarily overseeing all of these things and making sure it's being done safely and that the animals aren't in pain and this sort of thing. And so if you imagine like a little baby lamb less than a week old, being castrated or having their tail docked. It's a pretty grim picture.
Yeah, it sounds really horrendous. And then you have tail docking, you have the castration. Is tail docking the same as mulesing?
No, they're a bit different. So tail docking is to prevent fly strike. So it's flies laying eggs in their soiled wool. And so this is supposed to be a welfare benefit to the animals, but actually there's studies that have cast doubt on whether it is beneficial to them to do this. And yet it's still considered just something that farmers need to do. For mulesing, that's for merino wool sheep. And that's because in Australia they have wrinkly skin. So the wool can get really matted and soiled. And so to prevent this from happening, they essentially will slice off a bit of that flesh. So it's not just a tail. It's actually like you can see pictures of sheep with like these raw behinds where they've sliced off some of the flesh, and that's to get rid of that wrinkly bit to protect the wool from being soiled. So
So they just
that's a
chop
pretty
off a piece of
common
sheep.
yeah, it's a pretty common practice in Australia. There's been efforts to try and reduce it. So some retailers there won't buy wool from farmers who will use this practice, but farmers still say, well, we can't really do anything else. And it's hard to not be doing it. So yeah, the bottom line is that if you're using animals as a product, you'll say, but we have to do this. But you don't have to do it because you don't have to use them as a product. So, it all comes down to your perspective on what the animal is for, really.
Yeah, and I would argue that they are not for us to, use and
Hmm.
misuse, but a lot of people disagree. A lot of people think, looking at the properties of wool, that wool is a very beautiful product. It's cool when you want it to be cool. It's warm when you want it to be warm. That you can wear it a lot without it starting to stink. It's durable. It's something you can use for a long time. These are all great properties, and it's a natural product, right? It's not
Hmm.
synthetic. So there's a lot of people finding that wool is an amazing product, and they kind of like ignore that it comes with a lot of problems for these particular sheep. Are there proper alternatives for wool? And if you look at the wool, what would you say about the fact that, the properties of the wool are, so highly regarded?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is that the wool that you get in the jumper is not what it's like on the sheep. So if you've ever touched a sheep, which I've been doing a lot because I've been helping them up frequently in this field, it's quite greasy. So
Okay.
the product's also lanolin. That's the grease from sheep's wool that's used in some like beauty products and things like that, and moisturizer and stuff. And so their wool is quite greasy. So it needs to be it's called scouring to get rid of the grease from the wool and to get it into a condition that it can be used to make fine knit products. So like a merino wool sweater is very fine and soft. And so that's obviously not what it feels like when it's on the sheep. So it's gone through like quite a serious process to get to that point. So this
Are any
idea that it's really
chemicals used?
natural. Yeah, they need chemicals to get rid of the grease from the wool. It's quite carbon intensive. So there was a study by the Centre for Biological Diversity a couple of years ago into the Australian merino wool environmental impacts in particular. And they found that a merino wool sweater is 27 times more carbon intensive than an Australian cotton sweater. So this is partly from land use and but also the scouring process, it emits quite a lot of carbon as well. So it's not really this kind of lovely natural products necessarily. But I think when it comes to the alternatives, of course, people are thinking, well, what am I supposed to do? Buy some horrible synthetic thing made from, fossil fuels and plastics? Like that's no good either. And I would agree that's not a great alternative. I think it's not necessarily the only alternative. Of course, it's better if you're not buying as much stuff, not
Exactly. Yeah.
buying new so much, looking after the things you do have so they can last a lot longer. I would definitely not be encouraging anyone to engage in like fast fashion practices, buying, hauls of clothes that they're just going to wear once or not at all and then get rid of. Ideally, you want to be buying less. Yes, buying better, but I mean, there are other natural fibers that you can use, which you probably know more about. I'm sure you sell
Oh,
some
I mean,
from your
you just
shop.
mentioned cotton, that cotton from the same country, in this particular case, Australia, is
Yeah,
way less impactful. So yeah, there's definitely good alternatives that are
yeah.
also, or at least can be of very high quality if you choose to choose high quality, because you can also buy very bad cotton, of course.
Everything's got its impacts. And I think if we're looking at what the impacts of wool are versus, say, cotton, like, yes, cotton, sometimes there is quite a lot of pesticides used on it. So, you'd be wanting to look at organic cotton rather than pesticide trench cotton. But also, you've got to take into account other impacts that there are as well. So, yeah, the animals themselves, like what they've gone through to get to this point. And then that should figure into the balance of impacts that you're looking at when you're deciding on a material.
What I find very funny is that we wrote a blog once on human hair. You go to the barber and you collect the hair, and you can create a sweater from the human hair,
Hmm.
quite similar to how you could create a sweater from wool. It's hair. Because human hair is, human hair, basically
It's,
nobody is allergic to it because it's very
yeah,
natural to us. And humans, they wash their hair a lot, like it's like
yeah,
very clean. But when people think of that, they think, "Ew, that's so
yeah.
nasty. That's so gross, la la." But if you actually think of it, the sheep, they walk outside, they poo on themselves, they pee on themselves, they pee on each
Hmm.
other. They're super dirty. They roll in the mud, and they have the very fatty lanolin, wool on their body, and they
Yeah,
get sheared. There gets blood in. There's pus because of the mulesing and the till dog. All those things happen. It's really gross. And then they have to treat it in a chemical bath, and then all of a
yeah,
sudden it's natural, but like something that's
yeah.
actually natural, like human hair, that's gross. People have it all twisted around. I always find it
I
very
think
funny.
that's I think that's such an interesting point because I think, we have this weird idea of what products from what species are okay for us to consume. So that it is weird that we're freaked out by our own hair. And then equally, why aren't people freaked out by drinking milk from another mammal when they're adults? I wouldn't do that as an adult because I don't need to because I'm not a baby. And yet we justify it somehow as like fine and natural and nice to drink cow's milk or goat's milk or whatever it is. So, and that's no different really from having this, yeah, wool is fine, human hair no. Like this is a very confused value system that we have.
It's really weird. And of course, it's all about, what we've been exposed to over time, right? When you walk down the street, you will see a lot of ads everywhere for eating meat. So if you see that your whole life, then you normalize eating meat, and that is really normal. Everybody does. And if you don't do it, you're weird because you don't
Yeah,
adhere to the image that has been portrayed by society, basically,
yeah,
which is really interesting because now in Amsterdam, ads for meat have been banned, which
yeah,
is really
yeah,
good because I'm
yeah.
curious to see what that does, if that, will also reduce the meat consumption.
That's an amazing step, I think. And I mean, frankly, I don't really love walking around my city and being confronted with essentially images of dead animal parts on a day-to-day basis. I don't really want to see a burger described as juicy and dripping or whatever. Like that was an animal once, so that,
I mean, think
that's not
about
something I enjoy.
grossness. It is literally
It's really
bleeding.
gross.
It's, death. It's a body part. You're eating it.
Yeah.
It's weird. But
Mhm.
yeah, we were talking about wool. I have a last question when it comes to wool. Are there any misconceptions when it comes to the wool industry other than what we just spoke about? Things you've done some research on, anything that you would like to highlight about the wool industry?
I mean, we kind of covered it, just the idea that the sheep being out in fields is a good thing. It's not always, and it's certainly not environmentally a good thing. The idea that especially it's family farms and, people have been doing this in this family for so many generations as though that means that it's going to be good for the animals. I don't think that's necessarily true. It's really portrayed as this natural, nice, picturesque. You've got a very bucolic image of some sweet sheep hanging out in the field. And this is the thing, they are sweet. If you've ever spent time with sheep, which I have a sanctuary near Oxford that I've been out to a few times. The sheep are very sweet. Some of them are very skittish, don't want to hang out with you at all. That's fine. Some of them are really curious, really, want to come over for like a little pet and a scratch, and they love that. They've got personalities, but this gets
All
kind of
animals do.
lost. Yeah, and it gets really lost in this whole idea. I just think about the sheep out in the field near me and just think, if there were dogs out there being left like that, there would be uproar.
Yeah.
And so it's such a weird double standard that we have about our animals, and obviously a weird speciesist perspective. And we wouldn't want to see dogs suffering like that, see a dead dog left out for 5 days with no one coming to pick it up, dogs lame and fallen on their backs and not able to get up. Nobody would be happy to see that. And
No.
yet somehow with sheep, we're like, it's fine. It's just
Yeah.
that's just farming.
Super
So
speciesist. Super
yeah.
speciesist for sure. All right. Thanks so much for having
Okay.
me and
Yeah.
having this talk.